All right, welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny, and I am your host for today's important program. One of the numerous aspects of this ministry involves defending the truth of biblical creation. We also host some really awesome guests, and today is no different. I am thrilled to have Dr. Grady S. McMurtry with me for another live question and answer show on creation versus evolution. It is always a privilege to have Dr. Grady for these question and answer events. He has a wealth of knowledge. Dr. Grady, you're basically an encyclopedia worth of information, and you never fail to provide us with excellent and thought-provoking answers to very important origins-related questions. And so, Dr. Grady, I understand how busy you are, and so I do appreciate all the time that you give us for these sometimes monthly programs. So how are you doing today, my brother?
Well, I'm down in Florida thinking cool thoughts while you're up there trying to think warm thoughts.
Right. That's why I need to spend the winter where you are, Dr.
That's
Grady.
right.
A lot more comfortable.
Become one of our persistent snowbirds.
Right. I want to know what the secret is to being able to get so much done in a single day like you do, Dr. Grady.
I sleep 5 hours a night.
There you go. And coffee. Are you a coffee drinker?
No, I'm not a coffee drinker, but I do drink caffeine.
There. I don't know
Trying
if
to
it's
get
just the
this.
camera, but that's a big
Oh, that's a big one.
yeah.
I'm good for 2 or 3 of these a day.
Well, that explains why you have unlimited energy. So, Dr. Grady, again, I appreciate you being here. You're definitely no stranger to this topic, but also the Standing for Truth platform here. I do have in the description box for people who want to see more from you. I have links to your website, links to your YouTube channel, and links to where people can find more from you on my website and also YouTube channel. And so, Dr. Grady, can you tell us a little bit about yourself for anybody who might be unfamiliar with you?
Well, yes, I was born in a very liberal state named California, in a very liberal town called San Francisco, and was raised as an evolutionist. I was raised on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. I went on to earn my BS, MS, my doctorates in creation science. But I was originally a teacher of evolution, and at the age of 27 became a Christian. At the age of 28, a creationist. I've been teaching on it now around the world on 5 continents ever since. Uh, what happened was, at the age of 27, having been an evolutionist and an evolutionary teacher, I, in a search for truth, which I think goes very well with standing for truth, um, what a good scientist should do. Instead of seeking knowledge, I decided to seek for truth. And when I found out the truth is not a concept, that it is a person, I became a Christian. And 16 months later, after analyzing science afresh, I became a biblical scientific creationist. 100% from the Bible, 100% from science. The creation is true. Occurred about 6,000 years ago in 6 literal days.
Amen. Well said, Dr. Grady. I love the fact that you converted to creation in the sense that you've seen both sides. You've been an evolutionist, you are a creationist, and I think that's why you provide us excellent answers to these evolution related questions. And so, to set the foundation to what we are going to be discussing, and I've got some great questions for you. The audience does as well. I see questions already coming in. And so I want to ask you why you believe the creation versus evolution topic is so important in general.
Well, it's very quite simple, actually. My ministry is Creation Worldview Ministries because what you believe about creation or evolution determines your worldview. If you believe that there is no God, that time, space, mass is eternal, then you believe there's no creator God. If there's no creator God, there's no lawgiver. If there's no lawgiver, then there are no laws except the ones that we make up for ourselves. The problem with that is that every human being would have different laws that we would conflict. It leads to anarchy. It leads to all social ills, period. And I would suggest just a simple reading of Romans chapter 1, what Paul wrote from verse 16 to the end of the chapter would convince somebody. It's a very nice list. But on the other hand, if you believe in creation, then you believe there's a creator. Now, of course, there could be questions as to who that creator is. How does he reveal himself to us? But I would say that he reveals himself to us through the Bible. But the point is that depending upon whether you accept an evolutionary view with no creator, no lawgiver, no rules, standards of conduct, purpose, or whether you believe in a creator and who does have standards, laws, purposes for us, determines your worldview and how you look at the world. So a worldview is like a lens through which you see the world. And that lens, the prescription of that lens, is based upon your acceptance of creation or evolution. Now, once you accept creation to be true, which is obvious to anybody who looks in nature at the complexity of things we see that cannot possibly come about by random chance, then the next thing is, who is that creator? Which claimant is the right one? And when you look at the false statements by other religions, Christianity is the only religion in the world that has a rational, reasonable, logical, and evidence-based faith. The others do not.
That's right. That's another thing we agree on, Dr. Grady. So I appreciate that response. And what I'd like to get into here, and so firstly, before I do want to let the audience know that this is a live Q&A. And so we're giving you the opportunity to send in your creation, evolution, and origins related questions. And so please do make sure you're tagging me in the live chat at Donny or at Standing for Truth. And again, I want to remind people to check the description box if you want to see more from Dr. Grady here. And so, okay, I'd like to further set the foundation, Dr. Grady, for this afternoon's program by engaging some of the most common lines of evidence advanced for evolution or the theory of common descent. Now, I've saved several specific arguments for evolution based on their reoccurrence found on evolutionary bias websites and YouTube channels. And so you are going to be more than familiar with these, as
I'm
this
sure.
isn't your first rodeo. So the first one I want to pull up here, and this is from Khan Academy. And so they got an article, Evidence for Evolution, evidence that all life, including plants and animals, are related through common ancestry, Dr. Grady. And so the first one they point to is from Anatomy. And they say species may share similar physical features because the feature was present in a common ancestor. In other words, they call this homologous structures. So an argument from homology, Dr. Grady. What's the best way to respond to this point?
Well, when we talk about homology, the question is, does homology show a common ancestor, which is what they are saying in evolution, or does it come from a common designer, creator, God? There are two and only two options. And so at that starting point, it's like a balance beam. It's either we came from a common ancestor or a common God, a creator, designer, God. Now, the argument that's because we have homologous structures is absolutely false. What we have here is simply a perfect designer, a perfect engineer. We could liken it to a civil engineer or mechanical engineer. In the engineering universities, what we do is we come up with one really good design, and then we can modify it for many different purposes. And I challenge people in this issue of homology. Simply look at your hand. Okay, so here we have what's called the pendactyl pattern, the 5-digit pattern here. These bones are exactly the same bones in a horse's leg, a bird's wing, a bat's wing, a whale's flipper. Many creatures have this. And what that is the exact same bones in your hands, it's in your feet, it's in these various creatures. And this is because it's a really good design and has been modified by God to be used by different creatures for different things. But what is the primary purpose of the pendactyl pattern? It is to grab something. And so, for instance, in a human being, we grab something, we grab. But in a bird's wing or a bat's wing, these digits are used to grab air. If we're talking about the flipper of a whale, well, then we're talking about, in essence, grabbing water. And for creatures that walk on the land that have 5-digit pendactyl pattern, a bear or whatever, It's for grabbing the ground or for grabbing food, obtaining food. Same thing with whether it's a primate, lemur, etc. And so they're saying that we have these because we all have a common ancestor, and yet we have no common ancestors. Every time we find something in the ground, in the fossil record, basically, it's whole, complete, perfect as it is. We never find transitional forms in the fossil record. There's absolutely no record whatsoever. You can line things up by size and shape. That's a different proof called the proof by ranking. But it's an invalid argument. The fact that we have creatures that have similar shapes and so forth doesn't mean a thing that one came from another. And there's been no proof whatsoever found of the evolution through homology or the evolution through the process of ranking. And therefore, the whole argument for evolution falls.
Absolutely, great response. Human engineers build and design in homologous patterns, and so why shouldn't God? It's good design. Would you say that a lot of the homologous patterns that we see in the biological world are there for functional purposes, as you've been conveying?
Well, as I said, no creator, designer, person, God, but let's think about a person for a moment. None of them are designing without a purpose.
Right.
And let's challenge somebody for a moment with automobiles. Okay. Now, how many different kinds of automobiles are on the road?
A lot.
I mean, 100,000 since automobiles came into existence with 3 wheels and 4 wheels. But what do? We see literally tens of thousands of engineers over more than 150 years who were working on how to get the best kind of efficiency or whatever. And long ago, we decided that 4 wheels worked best. Long ago, we determined that one steering wheel works best. And so all cars have one steering wheel, unless it's for a special purpose. And so the thing that's driving engineers who design the appearance of cars crazy is how do we make our car look distinct, but still try to achieve the same objectives? And so you have millions and billions of man and woman hours of intellect being used to solve the problems, and they all end up looking very much alike. If you want an efficient car, you do not want a boxy car. You want an efficient, car. You don't get a gas guzzler. You try to figure out something else. So, in working on these designs, this is what engineering universities would do: teach students how to come up with these very common appearing designs, and yet allow for styling differences, for maybe the different kinds of fuels. But ultimately, they all end up in a very similar design because we are all trying to achieve the same thing. Well, God is a perfect designer, and He knew from the get go what to do, and He designed us perfectly as humans and apes perfectly as apes. Now we have a similar design because we have a common designer.
Right. Well said. And so I've seen proponents of evolution make the same argument based on homology, but on a molecular level. And so we share similar genetic sequences with chimpanzees, monkeys, dogs, fish, so on and so forth. And so what would be a good response to the argument from homology, but based on genetics, Dr. Grady?
Well, that's evolutionary fairy tales. Do you know that back about 1998, 1999, evolution started claiming that people and chimpanzees had 99% the same DNA? But do you know that they had absolutely no science for it whatsoever? They simply picked the number out of thin air.
Mm.
And then by 2000, they started comparing the human DNA with chimpanzee and ape DNA. But there's a lot more money in human DNA than there is in chimp DNA. And so the research went heavily to humans. And of course, in April of 2003, we came up with the human genome in the sense that we know the letters. Now, we don't know all the sentences, or we don't know the paragraphs, but we know all the letters. And even then, evolutionists realized with very, very partial ape DNA that we were not 99% the same. as a matter of fact, the number in the year 2000 was around 95%, but we still didn't know the ape DNA, and therefore, how can you possibly come up with an accurate number? So what happened? As we came along, the more we knew about the ape DNA, the greater the differences. Now, today it depends on exactly which parts of the DNA you're looking at. But the closest, some people would say, is 85%. But if you take a look at the entire detail of the DNA, we are only 70% similar to apes. But of course, you would assume that creatures that have a very similar structure, because DNA is structure, it's not memories, it's not education. But if you're going to have two creatures that are very similar in structure, you would expect the blueprints to be very similar. But it's not 99, it's not 96. At best, it's 85, and that's only on the coarse level. If you look at the fine level, it's only 70. Now, it is absolutely absurd to try to compare any organism using genetics in the way that you're talking about evolutionists do. Because, for example, if you were to do that, and I stress again, we are only 70% the same as the apes at a fine level, but you're also 50% the same as a banana. Now, you are 88% the same as a rat. So if we're going to use these comparisons, if you're 88% the same as a rat, but you're only 70% the same as an ape, which one are you closer to? And I would point out that we could do this all day. 35% the same as a daffodil. We can go on. You're 60% the same as a chicken. And which wonders, if you eat fried chicken, is it cannibalism? But these are absurd. You're 70% the same as apes, but you're 70% the same genetically as a sea slug, a sponge, excuse me, sea sponge. And you're 88% the same as a sea squirt. I mean, this is absolutely absurd. Sea squirt's a little tiny creature, lives in the ocean. When it's a young sea squirt, it has a brain, but when it becomes an adult, the brain dissolves away. Now, again, if you're 88% the same genetically, which one are you closer to? So you can't line up creatures using this genetic comparison. It is absolutely absurd that evolutionists even try to do it that way.
Well, and I appreciate the perspective you give us when you really think about how we're supposedly 50% similar to a banana.
Which is a plant, I would like to remind everybody.
Right.
And you're 60% the same as a chicken, which is a bird, and 88% the same as a rat, which is a mammal. At least it's a mammal.
Right. And so when you put it like that, you provide all the information that's available, then suddenly us being whatever similarity, some say 85%, 90% with a chimpanzee, it's really not convincing at all. And I think you nailed it on the point that our bodies have to perform a lot of the same functions as chimpanzees and your great apes. And so therefore we need a lot of the same DNA to code for the proteins that make up our bodies.
But Donnie, let me make another point along the same line.
Mm-hmm.
Primates, chimpanzees and primates and so forth, and humans only make 29% the same components, shall we say, to produce proteins. So if we only share 29% the same proteins, then how can we possibly be 99% the same? You see, when you look at the fine details, things really start falling apart fast.
And isn't it true that even in the similar sequences that we find between humans and chimpanzees, there's vast differences in the way those genes are expressed or regulated?
Well, and they're in different places on the chromosomes even. So the sequential order is not the same. And for instance, chimpanzees actually have 11% more genetic information in their genome than we do. And yet our genome produces things that the ape genome does not. There's, I think, 689 proteins that humans make that chimps don't even have. When it comes to the gender genes between us guys, okay, Human males have 60 gender genes, but apes only have 25. That means we are 58% different in the gender genes. And for any of the ladies that are watching, I hate to say this, really, I do, but um, you're 69% the same, but as as the females of the primates, but there's still a 31% difference. So given that human men are more than 58% different and human women are again roughly 31% different, how can you possibly say that we are only 1% different?
Right. It's flabbergasting every time I hear that. I mean, we talked about this last time. If you just look at the Y chromosomes,
Hmm.
which is uniparentally inherited DNA, the chimpanzee Y chromosome's half the size as the human Y. And in terms of overall gene content, architecture, and size differences, it's only about 35% the same. They're nothing alike, Dr. Grady.
No, and it is interesting. I think most people remember from at least junior high, if not even younger. Men have one X, one Y chromosomes for gender, and women have two X chromosomes.
Right.
What is interesting is, of course, this proves a perfect design because that means that when these chromosome pairs separate, you're going to then, in reuniting them, get 50% boys and 50% girls.
Mm,
And so this starts to show God's perfect plan for humans, one man, one woman united for a lifetime, even in the genetics in the garden. Um, there's something else that's kind of interesting. Um, in women, one of the X chromosomes, and we don't know why, but one of the X chromosomes knocks out the other one so that the women have just the one X for the gender.
right.
And in men, the small little Y chromosome has the capability of somewhere or another turning off the X chromosome in men. And yet we don't know how that happens. We just know that it happens. But this again shows a perfection when it comes to there's only two genders for species that are animals and humans and so on. We are not animals, we are humans. We are different for one important reason. We have a spirit, they don't. But we both have a body, we both have a soul, we both have biological life. Um, but a major difference that we have a spirit, they don't.
Right.
Um, but there's a lot of things we could say about the genetics. But again, the genetics proves that there is a creator God who made us this way with a perfect set of designs, and that you cannot claim that genetics can prove evolution. What's worse, of course, is that if we're going to talk about genetics, then we have to talk about mutations.
Mm,
And mutations always destroy, corrupt, damage, eliminate previously existing information. The evolutionist believes by faith that mutations, which always and ultimately will go downhill, can somehow or another cause progressive upward increase in intelligence or complexity. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. There are 900 million differences in the DNA between apes and people. I mean, we talk about percentages and it seems, oh, well, that's not that far. But consider 900 million genetic differences in the genomes.
wow. You know, as you've explained here, I feel like genetics, which is somewhat of a newer field, is a creationist best friend. Mutation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I'm glad you brought that up because more informed evolutionists, some of the PhD evolutionists I've engaged, a lot of them have conceded, okay, the similar sequences that are there for functional purposes will give you the common design argument. But how do you explain, and this is their argument, it's more of an assertion, Dr. Grady, but they'll say we've got junk DNA sequences that are reflective of evolutionary leftovers that are also shared across the biological world. And so they'll ask, why would a creator design biological organisms with shared junk DNA sequences? What's a good response to that?
Well, the first thing is that was disproved over 20 years ago.
Right.
Don't you think it's about time they caught up?
Mm-hmm.
There is no junk DNA. 25 years ago, when we completed the Human Genome Project in 2003, we were working on the ape genome at the time. But they would say, well, there's all this stuff here, and we don't know what it does. pseudogenes, retroviruses, other things. And therefore, this must be, again, by mutation, a corrupted previous loss of information. After all, think about it. They think genetics causes a upward increase in complexity or intelligence, and yet they were looking at it and saying, well, we got all this junk DNA that we're dragging around with us. It's counterintuitive to their position to begin with. Secondly, we have disproved 20 years ago there's no such thing as junk DNA. As a matter of fact, in the literature of the evolutionists today, you rarely find that term at all because they know there is no such thing as junk DNA. We have found a function for almost everything. And what that tells you is that there's a creator God who created it all perfect, that human sin corrupted it, and the mutation mistakes that are made over the time are causing it to go downhill. But it also tells you if you can't figure out what's there and what it does, it's just because we're not smart enough to figure it out yet. But every time we are smart enough to figure it out, they lose the idea of junk DNA. And so today we know that basically everything in the DNA has a purpose, at least one or more. It's kind of like, again, that argument about the loss of information, the argument in 1895 by Dr. Wiedersheim of vestigial and retrogressive organs and structures, that these are things we no longer need or they're on their way out because we're evolving into something bigger, better, faster, smarter. Well, the fact of the matter is that we now know of a one or more functions of every one of the 186 he mentioned in 1895. So again, this shows that first of all, there is no junk DNA, there's no junk structures, there's no retrogressive or uh, any structure, function, molecule, whatever, that didn't have an initial purpose. And if it's still there and we don't know what it's for, it's only because we've not been smart enough to figure it out yet. I mean, you have to take a look at reality. We are not getting bigger, better, faster, smarter. We're getting smaller, slower, and dumber. And that's been scientifically demonstrated. And so the worst enemy of the evolutionist is genetics, because what we see today is genetic entropy. And genetic entropy proves categorically that evolution is absolutely impossible in nature.
Absolutely. Another great answer. Dr. Grady, I'm going to start calling you the evolutionist worst nightmare.
Because I can be, yes, sir.
Yeah. So if I'm not mistaken, and if I remember correctly, we were talking about the X and the Y and then the X and the X for females. That X chromosome inactivation, because females can't have a double dosage.
You can't have a double. That's right.
Right. It's actually regulated by what the evolutionary community used to assume was junk DNA. And that's actually,
which obviously, if it had a purpose, it's not junk.
Exactly.
Every time they come up with this, it's counterintuitive to their position. And of course, some of them will say, well, mutations did damage previous information, but it gave a benefit to the creature. So it might survive malaria or it might survive something else because of this mutation. And I would agree, there was a benefit, but it didn't mean that there was new information coming into existence. It means that the corruption, loss, scrambling up of old information gave us a survival benefit in a particular sense, but it didn't actually make us bigger, better, faster, smarter. The reason we were surviving was because we became defective. And I know that sounds strange when I say it, but the idea that a mutation gives us sickle cell anemia, which it does, which means that we don't get malaria. Okay, that's a benefit, but it was because of a loss of information, not because of new information coming into existence. And I can assure you that anybody that has sickle cell anemia would trade you in a heartbeat not to have that particular mutation.
So what you're saying, even their best so-called examples of a beneficial mutation like sickle cell anemia, it's reductive. It's functionally compromising to living organisms that experience it. And it's a loss of functionality. How is that going to take your fish to fishermen?
Exactly. You see, so any benefit they can name is because uh, of a loss of information, and sometimes, such as the citrus experiment with bacteria, um, the information was already there.
Hmm.
It's just that the creature didn't express it
Right.
until it was put under real distress. And when it had nothing else to eat, it would eat something that it didn't normally eat, but the information was already there. It didn't, something new didn't come into existence. It was simply that under the stress, it became expressed. But again, it wasn't new information at a higher level of intelligence or complexity coming into existence. It was information was already there, but was expressed only under great duress.
You spoke about genetic entropy, the accumulation of these low impact, slightly harmful, deleterious mutations. And many evolutionary scientists in the conventional literature, they'll attempt to push this idea of beneficial mutation accumulation as a way to counterbalance the damage that we're seeing in terms of genetic degeneration. But as you're putting forth here, if these beneficial mutations are largely reductive and functionally compromising, then there is no counterbalance. Is that right, Dr. Grady?
Correct. Now, again, you can name a benefit, but it's because the creature became defective, not because it became, again, better engineering. It's actually a loss or corruption of information that provided a benefit. And it's the same thing as, for instance, let's take roaches. Why not? We came out with DDT, one of the greatest roach killers the world has ever known. And the reason it was taken off the market, twofold. Number one, a lot of lies. Rachel Carson lied about it, just lied through her teeth, but sold the public on it being bad. But I agree, it is a chemical which breaks down over a very long period of time, and we're much better if it's not in the environment. I get that. But why did we still have roaches? Two things. Number one, well, DDT killed a lot of roaches, and it did. It was a great roach killer. Um, some roaches were defective, and because they were defective, they survived, and DDT didn't kill them. Now, what happened? We did take DDT off the market, and I would argue it was probably for good reasons when we look at the true science. However, what happened is that those roaches that did survive mated with roaches that had never been tested with DDT because some of them, were never exposed to DDT in the first place. And what happened was the not defective roaches had that information reinserted by mating with the roaches that hadn't been exposed to DDT, did not have the defect. And what happened? That fills back in because in genetics, sometimes you only need one side of the chromosome to be effective and survive, even if the other side of the chromosome is safe. So let's just say the father was defective and the mother wasn't. But the mother provides the offspring with the non-defective component that it can continue to survive and reproduce. And so what has happened in nature is that all those perfectly healthy roaches that were killed by DDT were replaced by the offspring from defective and non-defective roaches, where the information was added back in through the mate, but it wasn't created. They didn't come up with new information. It was just supplied by those that didn't have the defect and were not killed by the DDT.
Right. Great insight, Dr. Grady. And so we got some questions here and some challenges from the chat. So let me start bringing some of these in. And I guess we'll start here. This goes back to the homology. Again, you're going to continue to be the evolutionist's worst nightmare. So this comes in from Lorraine Drosophila, and she's wondering if the homologous patterns that we see in the biological world are due to common design and therefore a designer, then why didn't this perfect engineer make perfect designs?
Well, the answer is in the question. God, the creator, did make perfect designs for whatever that was supposed to be. So, he made horses as perfect horses. He made people as perfect people. So Adam and Eve Prior to human sin, we're genetically perfect as human beings. But what happened? Human sin caused the start of what we were just talking about, genetic entropy. That is to say, mutations started happening, copying errors. A mutation is a copying error. It doesn't matter what field it is in. A mutation is a copying error. And so we've talked about it with humans and apes, but when you copy information, and that is what occurs in reproduction, you know, we copy mama and papa and we recombine them and we have offspring. Okay. But when there's a mutation, there's a copying error. That's a loss of information, that's a corruption, a damaging of material. And the problem is that while God knows ahead of time that this is true, he knows it's going to happen because of human sin, corrupting the perfect information. He knows that ahead of time. And he put 7 little engines in our DNA that spend their entire day, 24 hours a day, going up and down the genome, correcting the minor copying mistakes. But it will not correct the major copying mistakes, such as hemophilia and sickle cell anemia. But if it were not for the fact that God knew ahead of time that this is what was going to happen, and he did put these 7 machines in our DNA to correct the minor mistakes occurring every day. There's 1,000 to 1 million copying errors in every cell of your body every day. And so these 7 little engines, which almost never break, correct the minor copying errors, but they can't correct the big ones. But if it were not for that, we wouldn't be here at all. We talking today are approximately the 250th generation, or roughly the 250th copy. Sorry, I've had a very long day and a very long yesterday. So God did create it perfect, and human sin caused the copying errors to start. And at first they were very minor and not terribly important. But because the big ones are not corrected by these little engines, we continue to accumulate mistakes generation over generation, and they're not corrected. Now, today, we're losing 1 to 2% of our genetic information per generation. In every generation, you and I are passing on approximately 75 to 150 permanent errors, and they will not be corrected. And so, as this, what's called genetic load, continues to get bigger and bigger, like a snowball rolling downhill, the ultimate effect of this is that we will become sterile and cannot reproduce, and therefore we will become extinct. And this is one reason scientifically, well, not the only one, but one of the reasons we can know scientifically that the Lord is coming back soon. Because the Bible tells us that people will, in fact, be here to meet him when he returns. Maybe not me or you, but that the human population will exist when he returns.
You know, in light of everything you're saying, it's amazing, Dr. Grady, that we can speak, think, and do what we do in light of all of these generations of mutation accumulation. And so to that, I thank God for these amazingly designed DNA repair enzymes. I mean, millions of DNA breaks per day. Is that right?
Per cell per day.
Per
We
cell
got
per day.
1,000 to 1,000,000 per cell per day. Now, I'm a pretty big guy if you were to actually meet me in person. And so, big guys, we have upwards of 85 trillion cells. All of them have complete DNA except a few. Okay. There are a few that don't. Red blood cells, the gametes for reproduction. But most of them have complete DNA. However, because of this breakdown in copying, and it's so simple to understand this. You know, if I tell, get 10 people, line them up in a row. And this is called information theory, but it applies equally. That if I tell the first person a story for 5 minutes, just 5 minutes that nobody else in the room can hear, I then ask them to repeat the story verbatim, word for word, exactly as I told the story to them without one mistake. And they then tell the next person, and then that person tells the next person. And we just do it for 10 people. When I get to the 10th person, you won't even recognize the country it occurred in.
Right.
And that's called copying errors. It's mutations of the information, information of the story being passed from generation to generation, and it mutates and it goes downhill. It's not the same original story that we told to begin with. So it's defective. Now, with that in mind, I mean, this is just a really simple thing, but we could do it with a piano. If you had a grand piano, one of the finest in the world, and you have it perfectly tuned by a piano tuner, and then you give what's called a hammer, which is the tool that piano tuners use to tune pianos, and you led me over to that piano, but put a blindfold on me, but just by feel, I put the hammer on the various ends of the strings that hold them in place, and I can tighten and loosen them. The piano will go immediately out of tune. The first turn, the piano goes out of tune. Blindfolded, could I get it back in tune? And the answer is no. The more strings I turn, the more mistakes there are. And by random chance, I would never get it back in perfect tune. And that's the same thing that occurs with genetics. Again, it's the same thing as telling the story, and it corrupts over time. The tuning corrupts over time, because every time you copy something, you will lose, corrupt, destroy, damage previously existing information. And that's so easy to illustrate.
These are excellent illustrations, Dr. Grady. Now, I've heard many evolutionists, guardians of evolution, they will push back on the concept of.
Wait a minute, Donny. Forgive me, but let's call them priests, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
After all, evolution is a religion; it's not science. So these
Right.
guys are gurus and priests.
They've evolved from guardians to priests. It's true.
Yes,
It's a science fiction religion.
They're as much guardians and priests as it was in Egypt 3,000 years ago.
Amen. I agree.
And the problem with that is even that illustrates that evolution is not true. If you'll excuse me for just a moment, because think with me, how do evolutionists, how do priests, and I'll say, in Egypt, how do they maintain power over people? They do it through Gnosticism.
Mm,
And they say, I know, and you don't. And
right.
if you want to know, you have to come to me. But of course, what happens? The master, though he may intend, knowing that he is going to die at some point in his life, he may have every intention of telling the novice eventually everything he knows. But the problem is, he expected to live 10 years more, but he had a heart attack and died. So he knew something that the novice didn't know, but he didn't live long enough to pass it on. And this is exactly what you see in human history, that the mystical knowledge was corrupted over time and lost. This is one of the great stories of the Egyptian history from after the flood until the time of Christ. That in each generation they lost information from the masters who knew it previously. So it can apply to society as much as it can to genetics.
Right. Those are some great points. They've got the special revelation. They got the secret knowledge. We got to come to them because they'll oftentimes say, well, common descent, it's complicated. And that's why they don't like the analogies and the illustrations that we put forth that 99% of the population understand, and it refutes evolution, but they don't like it because they understand that it makes sense. So you got to come to them. They got the special knowledge, Dr. Grady. That's an excellent point. And go ahead.
No, I'm disagreeing.
So what they'll say to mutation accumulation is, and I know you've heard this one, we've discussed this one in the past, but they continue to push this argument. They'll say, well, as mutations accumulate, these low impact mutations, and populations degenerate, eventually they'll accumulate to such a high genetic load that Mother Nature or natural selection can see the load, remove it from the equation, and then those with a lesser load can thrive and continue on. Dr. Grady, what's a good response to that?
Well, it is pretty much a garbage argument if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because first of all, what would cause new information to come into existence without an outside designer, creator God? This idea that the genetic load becomes so great that those that have it are eliminated and those that didn't will continue. It's a garbage argument when you think about it. You will never get an increase in intelligence or complexity without the input from a greater intelligence. And again, this proves that creation is true. I would also like to mention, because you use the terminology, and we've talked about this in other programs, there is no such thing as natural selection. Nature doesn't have a brain. Nature cannot intelligently make a decision. And what actually happens, and this refutes evolution, is that God created creatures perfect as they are, and because of human sin, everything's in a downhill process. That's truth. But what has happened is that God provided a level playing field. And on that level, let's think like a pool table. And on that surface, that flat surface, he put different environments. So there's Pacific Islands here, and there's Arctic there, and you know, jungles here, and whatever, mountaintops and ocean bottoms. But he provided different environments. And then he gave all creatures, whether they're plants, animals, bacteria, people, makes no difference whatsoever. He gave all of them tools in their DNA uh, so that they could survive in an environment. But the problem is that those tools may or may not allow them to survive in a certain environment. And so, if they have the tools to survive in an environment, they will survive and continue. If they do not, they are not selected, they are eliminated. And so, what we see in nature is not natural selection. What we see is natural preservation of those creatures that can have the tools and live in that environment. And we see the elimination of those creatures that do not have the tools to survive in that environment. And therefore, we see the elimination of this creature in that environment, but it may survive in this one. And so nature doesn't select anything. It doesn't have intelligence. It can't make decisions. It's benign. It is simply, can you survive there? If you can, you do. If you cannot, you can't. And people have to understand that it is not natural selection. As a matter of fact, Charles Darwin was chastised for even using the concept because there were evolutionists in the mid 1800s who knew it was an invalid argument to begin with.
Right. They're giving Mother Nature, they're giving nature a mind where it doesn't have eyes to see. It can't see every single individual deleterious mutation that's accumulated and remove it from the population. And so they're personifying nature, it seems.
Well, that's just it. They are, again, as you say, suggesting that nature is sort of a concept that, again, nature is somehow another a person and has human attributes. They, as you said, personify. Um, it is an argument that is invalid to start with. And as I say, nature doesn't have a brain. It cannot make decisions. It is benign in the sense that it simply exists. But again, the creature will survive or be eliminated in its own right. It's not from an outside decision that somehow or another nature determines, oh, you're not fit, therefore out.
Right.
And the same thing goes along with survival of the fittest. It's not true. So the two greatest arguments that evolutionists typically, deceive people with, the survival of the fittest and natural selection, are usually the two greatest tools they try to use, are totally invalid because we know by wildlife management uh, experiments all over the world, really, that it is not the fittest that necessarily survives. It's actually the luckiest. If you think about it, wildlife management studies have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that it is the middle, the median, that actually survives the most. You will have big and you'll have small on both ends of the bell-shaped curve, but it's the ones in the middle that reproduce the most. It is not the big ones that reproduce the most, or nor the small ones. There's a very interesting little experiment done with wild sheep on an island where they had nowhere else to go, correct? and so I have photographs of this. There were big rams with big horns, and there were runts that had little horns, and then there was the average size males, right? Well, what happened was the big ones with the big horns, you think, oh man, they're going to outdo everybody. They're going to get their harem and they're going to have the most offspring. Was not true, because the ones with the big horns wore themselves out trying to do that. And the runt, well, he got in there once in a while and had an offspring, but it was actually the median that survived and reproduced the most. And so we also take a look at survival of the fittest is not true, because there are many animals that survive based on playing possum is the term, but by playing dead, by the weak, feigning being the weakest. And in fact, the scientific term is death feigning, where there are many creatures, certain snakes, possums, certain fish that play dead as a defense or as a hunting technique. Some fish play dead to get other fish to come towards them to eat the dead carcass, and then find out the guy's fully alive and eats them instead. Um, but there are snakes that turn belly up. Possums turn belly up. There are, for instance, ducks who feign a broken wing to draw a predator away from the nest. And so there are mechanisms that God has given these creatures, but it's not survival of the fittest. In real life, it's survival of the luckiest. Think about groups of sardines in the Mediterranean Ocean, okay, or Mediterranean Sea. Um, there's millions of them, right? But the biggest, strongest sardine is not necessarily the one that survives, because after all, when creatures come along to eat them, they don't say, "Oh, you're big and you're smart. I'll leave you." And no, if you're in the way of those jaws, you're gone. And I always like to give a little human thing on this, if you don't mind, Donnie. I think most people in the audience would know a guy named Bill Gates,
Yeah.
Microsoft, etc. Now, there are things that I don't agree with, but well, I can say he is a highly intelligent person. We'll just leave it there, right? Now, what if he steps off a curve at the age of 65 and gets hit by a bus? Now, is that survival of the fittest intellectually, or is it survival of the luckiest?
Right. Yeah. Those are good. I like the way you put it. Natural preservation, survival of the luckiest.
Yep.
And it's basically
And
just
natural elimination. Don't forget
right,
that.
natural elimination. Species are just being kept as strong as they can be. Nothing new is created, nothing novel is created. It's not going to rid populations of deleterious mutation accumulation, the genetic load you've been talking about. And every single population on the planet has a complicated combination of deleterious mutations. So aren't we all just multiply mutant? So removing some isn't going to stop the degeneration process, because mutations have accumulated population wide. There's nothing that can stop that, essentially.
Well, again, survival of the luckiest. There are those of us that might have a few less mutations because we're lucky,
Right.
and there are some that have more than the average. But again, we're averaging down. Period.
Right.
And people need to understand that that's really what's happening in nature. That evolution is totally invalid to explain what we actually see in nature.
Would this be an appropriate illustration, in your opinion, if we had a room of 100 people? Everybody's multiply mutant, but maybe, as you put it, some have a little more mutations than others. Okay, so let's say we were to rid that room of the 50 worst mutants. Well, what are you left with? You're left with 50 people who were still more mutant than the previous generation.
Exactly. It's absolutely true that your great grandparents were individually more intelligent and had faster reaction times than we do today. And I love my grandchildren. So that's two generations, my daughter and her children. I love my grandchildren, but they have 2 to 4% less genetic information in them than I do.
Right. So this concept of genetic entropy is the reality that every generation is just a little more mutant than the previous generation. We're more
Correct.
mutant than our parents and grandparents.
Correct. We're getting
Very good.
smaller, slower, and dumber, as I said.
Right. Exactly. Okay, well, I think that was excellent. So here's one from another skeptic. So as always, here we get a good mix of skeptics and non-skeptics, Dr. Grady, which is good because we're here to plant seeds, hopefully win souls. And so Jackson wrote, he says, pesticide, fungicide, and antibiotic resistance have all arisen through duplication, so genetic duplications apparently, and subsequent point mutations. To him, this is new or novel information. What's a good response, Dr. Grady?
Well, first of all, when he says duplication, when we see duplication, it's accidental. It was not intentional. Accidents do happen in nature, and accidents happen in the copying of genetic information. And so some people may have 3 copies of a particular gene, and others may have 6. But that's simply a duplication of previously existing information. It is not new, it is not novel. It is simply an accidental duplication of previously existing information. And it could be detrimental because if you make too much of a particular protein, it might be hazardous just as much as not having enough of a particular protein. And he says, and subsequent point mutations. Well, we covered that earlier. Again, bacterial resistance, pesticide, fungicide, antibiotic. Let's talk about antibiotic and bacteria because I think most people in the audience would be, most familiar with that. What happens when we have antibiotics? Antibiotics are actually like a key that fits a lock. And so what do we do? There's a receptor on the cell wall of a bacteria. There's an internal enzyme necessary for its metabolism. But bacteria. Let's say that there are 100 points on the bacteria or inside the bacteria that we could attack. And so we come up with a antibiotic. And what does it do? It will kill that bacteria in a heartbeat. And the simplicity of this is if I simply illustrate with my hand, here's the lock and here's the key, and the antibiotic fits in the lock of this cell wall receptor, for instance. And by doing that, it prevents the cell wall receptor from functioning and the bacteria dies. What happens? The bacteria that survive are not coming up with new information at a higher level of complexity or intelligence. What happens is actually that the lock deforms. There's a mutation and it deforms. Now, our key will no longer fit in the lock, but what happens? The bacteria can survive, but it metabolizes slower. So it's not as fit, if to use an evolutionary term, but it can still reproduce. It just does it slower. And so now our antibiotic will not kill the bacteria, but it does affect the bacteria because the defective bacteria, again, reproduces slower, metabolizes slower. And so, okay, well, 1 down, 99 to go. So then we take a look at an enzyme that's inside the bacteria. And we find a key that will fit that enzyme and lock it up from being used. And when that happens, the bacteria will die. But then there's a mutation in the bacteria. And again, it doesn't get better, it gets worse. It becomes defective. And our key will no longer fit the enzyme. It is now defective, but we can't kill the bacteria either, but it does continue to metabolize slower. It reproduces slower. And after we do this a few times, we're actually doing an experiment in nature to see just how many things we can knock out and a creature still live. Just how defective can it be before it simply can't function at all. And the interesting thing is, if we take that defective bacteria that our antibiotics can't kill, and we put it back into the environment, the natural environment, not a lab, and we put it with bacteria of the same kind that are not defective, the not defective bacteria will overwhelm their relatives who are defective, and they will be eliminated. And this is a very personal thing with me because my own mother died from a totally perfect operation. The operation was perfect, but the patient died because she went septic 2 weeks after an operation. But evolutionists sell this idea, this terminology, superbug. meaning that somehow or another the bacteria evolved, created some kind of new information or new process that kept it from being killed by our antibiotic. And that is not what happens. What really happens is the bacteria becomes defective and it cannot be affected by the antibiotic, but it does still metabolize and reproduce, but slower.
Well, another comprehensive and excellent answer, Dr. Grady. I'm always mind boggled when they use this example here on the screen, Dr. Grady, as you've demonstrated. I mean, I've got a book here. If I gave you if I gave you 10 copies of this book that you already own, is there really any new information? Of course not. It's just the same information duplicated 10, 20 different times. Now, if we add in point mutations, that would be single spelling mistakes or typographical errors into the new books. That's just going to result in a more messed up copy of the book that you already own. So it's
Correct.
further degeneration. Is that right, Dr. Grady?
Correct. Absolutely. After all, think about it. When you copy things, you can either copy perfectly, in which case there's no change whatsoever. There's no increase or decrease in information or complexity. It's the same, a perfect copy. And the only other way you can copy something is for it to go downhill. You can either copy it perfectly or imperfectly. You cannot copy it more perfectly. And so mutations, even though there may be benefit in the sense of survival, is not a benefit in the sense of being better. It only survives because it's worse.
Absolutely right. Just like we said earlier, Dr. Grady, the field of genetics is a creationist best friend.
Amen.
Okay, so and there's a lot of questions coming in here, so we'll do our best to engage some. Redefine living. So this goes back earlier. We were talking about homology, and very briefly, you brought up transitional forms. And so many in the evolutionary community, they'll say that we have found some transitional forms. One specifically, they call the famous fishapod, which is Tiktaalik, that they believe it. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that one.
Tiktaalik rosea, to be specific, which was found in Canada. You can be proud of that.
There you
go. It was found on the south end of Ellesmere's Islands up in the Northwest Territories. But you have to remember what really happened. In the up to the 1920s, evolutionists believed, and I would point out, since 2,500 years ago, evolutionists have taught that fish walked out of the water and became people. Now, that story has not changed in 2,500 years. So, evolutionists are looking for this in the fossil record. So, although ancient people did recognize fossils as having been creatures that lived in the past, they didn't know much about it and didn't have the scientific tools to analyze or whatever. But up to the 1920s, people believed that fish walked out of the water, became people. Okay, that was their religion. And they found fossils that were supposed to be 300 million years old of a creature called the coelacanth. And they looked at the coelacanth, which is an ugly fish, but it has extra appendages, extra little fins on its body. And interestingly enough, the coelacanth has an air bladder. What that means is it can, even though it's not necessarily making the intentional decision, but it does make the decision, that it can go up and down like a submarine. And so up through the 1920s, evolutionists were saying, well, the coelacanth, it has this air bladder in it, and it can go up and down in the water like a submarine, and these extra fins. That what happened was the coelacanth had walked out of the water onto sandbars and mud banks, that the air bladder had evolved into the first lung to breathe air, that these little extra appendage fins at the bottom had like little legs, allowed it to walk up, and it became the first land dwelling, air breathing creature that eventually evolved into people. I mean, that's the basic story. But in the 1930s, off the Comoros Islands, we found them alive. And then 60 years later, we found another population alive off of Indonesia, and they look exactly like the fossils. And so we know it has never changed, and supposedly, according to them, in 300 million years, and it's alive today. So can't possibly be the fish that walked out of the water and became people, correct? And they said, but we know that evolution is true, and we know that there's a fish that walked out of the water and became people. And then, miraculously, April 2006, they found the Tiktaalik rosier. And remember that we didn't find the back end. We found heads and we found mid bodies and so forth. We found two front fins. And they say, oh, Eureka, Eureka, we have found it. This is the fish that walked out of the water and became people. But fame is a fleeting thing. Andy Warhol, the very famous artist, once said, everybody gets 15 minutes of fame, correct? Well, they found the Tiktaalik rosier in 2006. Later research proved that the fins were not attached to the spine, that these fins could not possibly have supported the body on land, and therefore Tiktaalik rosier was not the fish that we had, in fact, evolved from. And only 4 years later, we found the fossil footprints of a four-legged creature walking on land in Poland. And that this creature that supposedly predates the Tiktaalik rosier was almost 20 million years older in history, according to evolutionary timeframes. I would say they all died 4,500 years ago,
Right.
but nonetheless. So the story of this particular fish, it was thrown out within 4 years of its discovery, when we found that actually there was a creature that quote unquote predated it that had been walking on land. And so again, fame is a fleeting thing.
That's a great response. So the story goes fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, they find this so-called fisherpod with Tiktaalik. But then years later in Poland, if I'm not mistaken, they find these tetrapod foot tracks
That's what I just was
predating.
talking about.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a great
Predating
point.
it between 15 and 20 million years earlier, proving that this was not a fish that walked out of the water. And again, we studied the anatomy now, and we know that it could not have supported itself on land with those fins, etc. So they've all been thrown out. But of course, evolutionists know the story is true, and so now they are recruiting you to give them money to go out and find it.
Right. These government grants, right?
Yep.
And so you've got true, as you put it, you nailed it. You got true tetrapods existing before Tiktaalik, which is supposed to be that transition. Now, what I've heard them say, I wonder what a good response is. They'll say, well, maybe Tiktaalik wasn't the direct ancestor. It was just maybe a side branch, but it is an example of a transitional form, even though there were true tetra. Is this a rescue mechanism, Dr. Grady?
Well, that's just it. It's not a rescue. It can't rescue the theory at all,
Right.
because we simply see that every creature is whole, complete, and works perfectly well as it is. We have never found a transitional form, a true transition. Now, you can line things up by size and shape, but that does not prove that one came from another. And so the argument they try to use to prop up this fairy tale for adults doesn't work either.
Do you believe we find interesting mosaics? You know, what would be the best way to explain something like Archaeopteryx, who they say is transition from theropod dinosaurs to birds? They'll even say birds today are modern dinosaurs.
Well, of course, that doesn't work at all. If you really want to talk about a mosaic, we should talk about a platypus.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
much better
That's a
mosaic.
true mosaic right there.
That's a true mosaic. I believe that at the sixth day of creation, after God had made all the animals and the plants, and he was just getting ready to make Adam and Eve, the Father looked over at Jesus, and he's got a few parts left over, and so he said, "Okay, watch this," and he made a platypus.
Right.
Yeah, but Archaeopteryx was defined as a true bird decades ago. No legitimate scientist believes it anyway that it's a transition from a reptile to a bird. We have at least 7 species of birds today that have claws on their wings, at least at some time during their life cycle. We have birds with teeth, at least during some part of their life cycle, if not their entire life cycle. Um, so this is simply a bird with specific features that allowed it to survive in a specific environment, but this is by design. And we have found bird fossils that are true birds. I mean, creatures that look like a modern raven, for instance. in layers that are supposed to be much older, according to evolutionists. Now, again, I say they're the same age, but supposedly much older than Archaeopteryx, proving it is not the first bird. It is not the evolution of a reptile into a bird. Um, the greatest of ornithologists, even though they may believe in evolution as a personal belief, would tell you in a heartbeat that Archaeopteryx is simply a bird. And we have found perching birds, true birds, and so forth. We even found feathers that are older than Archaeopteryx. So you cannot use it. That's an antiquated argument that's been thrown out years ago.
Excellent response. Great responses to Archaeopteryx and Tiktaalik, two of their favorite so-called transitional forms. So, okay, let's move on to next question here. And this one, actually, what I'd like to do, Dr. Grady, is bring up, and we'll have to continue this the next our next show.
You're hedging, Donny. You're hedging.
Yeah. I'm failing. I'm looking at these and I'm thinking, well, we kind of just addressed fossils, right? We've kind of addressed direct observation. You're just so comprehensive, Dr. Grady. You're anticipating all of these points. And so, you know what? I'll ask this then. So here from Khan Academy, they say fossils. As you know, we addressed anatomy very thoroughly, and I appreciate that. So now they got fossils. And what they like to say, not only in terms of transitional fossils, but they'll say, well, the ordering of the fossil record reflects large scale change from fish to amphibians to reptiles to mammals to man, basically. And so what's the best way to respond to what they're saying? Fossils as evidence for common descent, Dr. Grady.
Well, again, fossils are objectively proof of a common designer using, again, the same types of body structures for many different creatures, many different functions. However, this whole idea that the fossils are in a specific order fails when we take a look at the fossil record. Now, I, as an evolutionist, growing up on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley, spent a lot of time in the paleontology laboratories, highly indoctrinated in the concepts of evolution. However, I do want to say there are layers in the ground. There are fossils in many of the layers, not all of them, but many of them. But there is nowhere in the world where you can find the fossil record as presented in the geological timescale in a textbook. There's nowhere in the world it actually exists. They take layers from different parts of the world and assemble them in the order they want them. They can, and they also don't tell you a lot about the various flaws, such as polystrate fossils. They don't tell you that we have found fossils here and fossils there. We keep extending back into deep time, according to evolutionists, that every single phylum goes all the way back to the very beginning, that they all start at the same time. They don't talk about fossils that have been found in Precambrian layers that contradict evolution. There are so many flaws in the whole thing that they don't tell you about. They present it as a perfect record of a slow and gradual process over time, but it's not true. We find the layers upside down, missing, folded, polystrate fossils. And what a good scientist asks, and I would say also a good Bible student, because I'm both, but that's because I was a good scientist to start with. A good scientist always asks two questions, and they fail to ask those two questions. And the first question is, what's there? Now, they say, well, there's layers with fossils in it, but they are not found in the ground as they are presented in the textbook. And the second, more important question in science and in Bible study is, what's not there? So if these layers are actually slow, gradual accumulation over long periods of time, please tell me, why are there no soil horizons? Why are there no V-shaped erosion marks? Why are there no plant holes, animal holes in these layers? What we find are layers that were actually all laid down at the same time. And while they were still soft mud layers in the process of lithifying or solidifying, if you prefer, were folded in many cases. And in some cases, actually moved 90 degrees. So going from the horizontal to the vertical in blocks. without any distortion at all. Well, the only way you could have that is a worldwide flood where they all formed at the same time. Also, if you'll take a look at secular research, so these are not Christians who are trying to, fabricate things, but at secular sedimentation labs at Colorado State University in the United States, and also at a sedimentation lab in Paris, France, um, we have found that the layers all form at the same time, whether
Right.
in still or moving water. That what happens is the layers all form at the same time and simply extend in the direction of water flow. But we'll do it in a vacuum too. You can take sand grains of different sizes, drop them in a vacuum, and they'll form layers. So the actual evidence, there's two ways of interpreting the layers in the ground, the fossils in the ground. There's two ways. One's called historical geology, and of course, this is what evolutionists do. They try to stress the idea that these layers are billions and billions of historical years. And there's flood geology. And flood geology lines up with the Bible that there was a worldwide flood of the entire earth lasting 1 year, and that these materials were at one time in different places than they are today, but that the flood caused these materials to be ground up, dissolved, um, the death of creatures, tree trunks, etc., roots, animals, and that these were then redeposited in these layers. Now, there is a mild truth that the layers have a tendency to show an increase in complexity as we would think of it. That is to say, there's the idea that you'll find fish typically here and then reptiles there. But the fact of the matter is, there's so many exceptions that you cannot really argue it.
Right.
But this is also what you would expect in a worldwide flood, because the more mobile, larger, more intelligent animals and creatures are going to try to go up and up and up. The old King of the Hill game we've played as children. So this is why we do find the more complex creatures, as we might think of it, um, towards the top. And again, sea creatures. Let's think about it. This oysters and clams can't run. So in a worldwide flood, they're going to get buried first. They got nowhere to go. But my second question about that would be this: why then do we find clams in every single layer?
Right.
What is going to cause a brachiopod, a clam, an oyster to be buried in the same layer with a T-Rex? More and more evolutionary geologists are admitting that what we see in the ground are the results of flooding. Now, they want to say it's many floods over a long period of time to get what they want to interpret as an evolutionary historical position. In reality, it's one flood that did it all at one time. And so historical geology, which lines up with the Bible, is a much better cause and effect of what we see in the ground than the evolutionary view of slow and gradual. If slow and gradual were true, the evidence would be different.
So many great points there, Dr. Grady. The flume experiments, these layers that are rapidly formed, as you pointed out, is an extremely important point, which shows that it doesn't take long at all for these layers to form. And another frequent guest we have on is a creationist geologist, John Mackay. And he said in the field, he's looked for fossils and he finds quite different to what we see in the evolutionary textbooks. He'll find mixed environments, deep water organisms, shallow environment organisms, and land organisms, just all mixed together, not reflecting what.
That's why I say, why do we have clams with T-Rexes?
Right, it's all mixed.
There's a mixing here. And then again, the polystrate fossils, the upside down layers, the missing layers, the folded layers. There are so many things that are totally inconsistent. Now, I've got a great photograph taken out in British Columbia at the top of the British Columbian Rockies, showing massive foldings at the top of those mountains, showing that they were laid down as wet mud layers all at one time, i.e. the flume experiments you're talking about, and that while they were still wet, because of the tectonic movement of continents that occurred very rapidly during the flood of Noah, that they were then folded while they were still wet, because you can't fold rock.
Right.
If you try to fold rock, it's going to break.
Mm-hmm.
So these things had to be wet and what is technically called in science plastic, but foldable. They're moldable by compression. Um, while they were still wet, they could not have acquired this trait after they had dried out and lithified.
And Dr. Grady, we find these dramatically folded masses of rock layers all over the planet.
I have hundreds of pictures from every continent.
Wow.
It does not matter where you go. I've got them from the Sierras in California, where I grew up, to folded layers in Australia. I just got pictures all over. And many mountain ranges are made out of sedimentary layers. So they were originally dried out mud. Well, first of all, if they were dried out mud, then that means they must have been there by a flood deposit. So this is material transported by water. However, they are upside down, backwards, missing layers. And I have some great photos of some of the mountain ranges in Canada that the layers are out of order according to the evolutionary time frame. I've got mountain ranges all over Europe, including the Matterhorn is in the wrong order according to the evolutionists. And so we find so many flaws that while the evolutionist attempts to deceive people by telling them fairy tales for adults, it simply isn't true.
So we have what they portray in their textbooks, and then we have reality, which, if I'm understanding correctly, you are saying is not as neat and organized as we see in the evolutionary textbooks.
Again, I want to stress this is common on all the continents.
Right.
All the continents. There's only three kinds of rock, if you remember your junior high school geology course. But we find these discrepancies in what they believe and teach all over the world. And some of the photos are so easy to look at and see for yourself if somebody just shows them to you, such as I would in presentations. I've got an hour-long presentation on simply, what's in the ground versus what's in the textbooks,
Yes.
just to show they are lying through their teeth, and I will say that all day.
Amen.
So,
are you familiar with this? So here's a skeptic in the chat, and they're wondering if you're familiar with the clay drying problem. So maybe he's insinuating that there's an issue in terms of the Genesis flood. Any thoughts on that, Dr. Grady?
well, I don't know what he's thinking of in the sense that if he's talking about clays drying on the surface today and cracking and so forth. But think with me for a moment. When you are burying hundreds and hundreds of layers of different kinds of materials, once they're buried, they're not going to be able to move other than the tectonic forcing on those things which are still wet. And so, while you might think of a problem on the surface by looking at it in a modern time, that does not mean there's a problem with it in the ancient time. Now, again, the flood was not one day instantaneous, a mile deep. The flood was 300 days long,
Right.
up 150, down 150. And during that time, there's going to be tides. And during that time, because of the tides, but the continuous rising of the water as a total, you're going to have places where there are going to be spots where creatures can live, at least temporarily, maybe lay eggs and try to have nests, which we find all over the place. Um, but what happens? The water and the tides continue to rise. And so these nests get buried, and we find them fossilized. And then finally, the mamas and papas die on the surface when there's no other place to stand. But many of their relatives have died and have been buried in these wet mud layers again. So while you could find places that during the flood temporarily dried out and were then covered, again, that's not anything that contradicts the flood model. Again, during the recession phase, the second 150 days, we're going to have erosion as the waters are rapidly eroding through wet mud layers. They're rapidly eliminating a lot of the wet mud into the ocean. One has to remember that what you see today is what's left, not all that was deposited. And so during the recession, again, there are going to be places that start drying out first and then later and later and later in the recession phase. So I see no problem with any drying.
So we have plenty of time then during this year-long flood for these rapidly formed layers to harden.
Well, they're going to harden afterwards. But
Yeah.
think about it. When the flood is over, that's 300 days where the water goes away. And remember that the details of the flood are in Genesis, but the chronology of the flood is in Psalm 104, verses 5 through 9,
Mm,
very
right.
clearly.
Hmm.
And so Psalm 104, verses 5 through 9, God sent a worldwide flood. The waters were above the mountains. Then the waters, verse 7, the waters then go away. And there's a lot of erosion. But then think about the story of the ark and the people and animals. The ark landed, but they didn't open the door immediately. They waited 70 days, and then they opened the ark doors and the animals walked out. And the reason for that, number one, the earth was covered with wet mud layers. You can't just walk out. I mean, some places, if you'd have walked out, you'd have just sunk in a mile, kind of thing. But the 70 days allows the surface areas to dry out hard enough that you can walk on it. And there are seeds in those surface mud layers, and 70 days allows them to germinate. And of course, the story of the two birds illustrates the truth of this. The raven goes out, it can live on dead bodies, it doesn't need plants, but the dove is a vegetarian. And so the first time the dove goes out, there isn't enough vegetation. The seeds have not germinated sufficient for her to live. But the second time she goes and she comes back with a sprig from a freshly germinated olive tree and proof that there's now enough germination for the plants to provide all the food that is necessary for the animals on the ark, and Noah releases them. And so there's that 70 days to prove that the surface had to dry out before they could walk on it, and the seeds had to germinate before the animals would have food. And I think that's perfectly illustrated for us.
Well said. Dr. Grady, you're a fan favorite here. We've got questions to keep us busy till same time next week, but we're gonna have to start we're gonna have to start winding down and look
Sorry
forward
about
to.
that.
Oh no, you're doing a great job. I think this has been an excellent Q&A here. We've touched on quite a bit. Maybe we'll wrap it up with one or two more questions, and we'll look forward to your next appearance here, Dr. Grady. Like I said at the beginning, you're a wealth of information and you're well-rounded on so many topics. We touch on geology, genetics, biology, fossils. So you're a jack of all trades, brother. So here's a question that this is a big one that's still being put forth. You'll even see it in museums. What is the best way to respond to the horse transitionary series presented by proponents of evolution?
Even guys like Stephen Jay Gould said that was foolishness. That was disproven and thrown out 70 plus years ago. The story of Eohippus becoming Mesohippus, Pliohippus, Equus, that was thrown out by evolutionists over 70 years ago. There isn't one of them believes it. As a matter of fact, Eohippus, the dawn horse, which is what the words mean, has been reclassified as Hyracotherium. It is a rock badger. It isn't even related to horses in any way whatsoever. And if you take a look at the transition as presented by evolutionists in old material, because frankly, they don't do that anymore unless they're really, really trying to deceive people. But if you'll take a look at the number of ribs, for instance, it changes up and down in number. Now, if evolution's true and it goes in one direction, then you would think that the expression of ribs would get more numerous over time as the creatures got bigger, correct? But you'll notice that the ribs actually go up and down in number in the series. Again, Eohippus was thrown out as a rock badger 75 years ago. Um, the series doesn't exist, and any legitimate evolutionists, and there are honest evolutionists. Now, I disagree with them, but they're honest at least. I would tell you there's no such thing.
Yeah, it goes the same way as Archaeopteryx, as Tiktaalik, this horse series. And so they do really lack transitionary progressions if large scale evolution is true, Dr. Grady. And so, okay, I think we'll wrap it up with this. Might as well get a little astronomy in there, right?
Sure, why not?
Might as well make it as complete as possible. So Taylor K, I appreciate your question. Question for Doc. What is cosmic radio background noise? And why do evolutionists say it points to the Big Bang?
Again, that's been disproven, although you will find it as a more modern example. But the constant background radiation, it's about 2.7 K, is background noise. Now, they say this is a background noise from the Big Bang. I would suggest, if you'd like a little help on that, you can go to creationworldview.org, go to our articles, it's free, and simply go to our articles page. There's a little search engine there. You can type in things like redshift, and it'll take you to an article that addresses the fact that the redshift, which is supposed to be due to the expansion, supposedly, of the universe, supposedly because of the Big Bang, is absolutely bogus. Yes, we do see redshift of light. I'm not denying that. However, if the Big Bang were even true to begin with, then the redshift should be a nice, smooth, linear or curvilinear in terms of the reading. And of course, when the redshift was first found and said to show that the universe was from a Big Bang, it's been completely and totally disproven. First of all, modern research by even evolutionists have proven that the redshift is not a smooth curvilinear feature. And in fact, the redshift occurs in repeating distances like concentric shells, and it proves that the Earth is in the galaxy that is in the center of the universe. There's a lot there, and I don't know how much time you want to spend on it, Donnie, but redshift can actually occur without expansion. Redshift can occur for at least 7 reasons that do not require expansion. And since we now know that the redshift is quantized, meaning that it occurs at regular distances, that shows that there had to be an intelligence that put it there. You don't get constant sequences without an input from intelligence. So the redshift is actually a good friend from the standpoint of astronomy for creation. And that God really allows us to see the redshift more like a fingerprint of Him being the creator, and it's a thumbprint on the universe. And it does show that, as the Bible says, we are at the center of the universe. Now, we're not at the dead center of the universe. We are in the galaxy, which is at the dead center of the universe. Because if we moved our galaxy one diameter in any direction, you would no longer be able to see these concentric circles or shells.
I think for our next show, we'll have to start with Big Bang because there's so many good points there. I feel like we could do an entire 2-hour show on why the Big Bang is false and why it's been refuted. So, Dr. Grady, again, time has flown by with you. Just a lot of excellent information. We've had a great, very lively chat tonight. And so, as always, I appreciate your time. I know how busy you are defending the truth of biblical creation, planting seeds, and winning souls, my brother. So, Dr. Grady, I want to hand it over to you in case you had any final words, final thoughts, anything you'd like to leave myself and the audience with.
Well, I want to point out that, again, good science supports everything that the Bible says. The Bible doesn't need science to support it, but good science does support it. And I want to invite anybody in the audience to come to creationworldview.org. We have over 100 free articles. We just put up 2 new ones yesterday. We have over 400 free short videos. Of course, we have a bookstore too, but I'm just going to point out that we have a lot of free material as well, and that you really can trust the Bible, and science really does support what it says.
Amen. I've got links to your YouTube channel, which you got a ton of great short videos answering all these questions, and also your website, Creation Worldview, for people to see in the description box. And also a link on our website, standfortruthministries.com. If you go to the guest section, look under Dr. Grady McMurtry, and you'll find just hours and hours and hours of these Q&A programs with you, me, Matt, and Sam, Dr. Grady. Okay, well,
yep,
no, that's okay. Perfect timing, actually. So God bless you, Dr. Grady. I always enjoy these and look forward to them. And to the audience, thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate the support. Thanks for the comments. the questions and even the challenges. We do appreciate our skeptics, and we will do our best to answer your challenges and objections. So with that, God bless all. Standing for Truth is out.